This is Ashley Newby, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, cultural workers, political organizers, and everyone in between in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, we are going to talk with Dr. Casey Phillip Wong, Assistant Professor of Social Foundations of Education in the Department of Educational Policy Studies at Georgia State University. His ethnographic and community-engaged research studies how youth enduring colonization and mass incarceration organized through education to build community outside of the terms, logics, and structures of coloniality and carcerality. He seeks to interrogate the colonial logics of racial categorization, the carceral politics of human movement and containment, and ontologies that determine our relations to lands, waters, and beings across space and time. This involves critically questioning how compulsory state-sanctioned schooling has continued to be constructed as the great equalizer, and accordingly, education research as a benevolent contributor to this material and ideological project of education. He elucidates this perspective in an article published in 2021 in the Review of Research and Education, The Wretched of the Research, Disenchanting Man Too as Education Researcher and Entering the 30th Chamber of Education Research. As a part of this research, Dr. Wong aims to advance justice by investigating and developing culturally sustaining and strength-based pedagogies to teach and learn otherwise. He researches and collaborates with communities to affirm, foster, sustain, and revitalize educational institutions and relations that critically center overlapping and interconnecting African, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, and Pacific Islander communities. His research has been published within high-impact peer-reviewed journals such as Educational Researcher, Journal of Diaspora, Indigenous, and Minority Education, Departures in Critical Qualitative Research, Equity and Excellence in Education, and Teachers College Record. Likewise, among accepted presentations across his interdisciplinary specializations, he has received invitations to share his research with presidential and vice presidential sessions at the American Educational Research Association, an executive session at the American Anthropological Association, and a presidential session at the American Association of Applied Linguistics. The AERA 2025 presidential program will feature a session that he is co-organizing with Dr. Joyce King to honor the work of Sylvia Wynter, Research and Rewriting Knowledge for a Just Education Renewal, Lessons and Learning from Sylvia Wynter. In concert with his research agenda, he has sought to advance just futures through partnering and working directly with county offices of education, school districts, schools, and educational institutions within the U.S. and internationally to address the ongoing impacts of structures and processes of coloniality and carcerality. This work has included invitations to conduct a critical race analysis of the primary education policy put forward by the state of California to address disproportionalities in discipline and academic achievement, to study the efficacy of literacy education in California as an expert witness on culturally relevant and sustaining pedagogies, and to examine the Los Angeles County Juvenile Justice System's Road to Success academies, and to recommend a pathway towards abolition. Hi, Casey. How are you?
Good. Thanks for the grand introduction. I feel like after that, I need to retire now. Like, I need some. And that's fun. I'm honored to be here with you, the legend, for all your brilliant and beautiful work, so just honored to be here with you. So.
Well, I appreciate that. It is definitely an honor to have you here and talk about all of the work you're doing, including your upcoming book, which sounds phenomenal. And just seeing your work and trajectory over, because we've known each other a while now.
Yeah, a long time. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's like, is it really like 15 years?
Yeah, I think at least, right? Yeah.
Wow. So it is so good to see you from when we were both at NYU in the Hip Hop Ed Center to now.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a journey.
Absolutely, for real. Wild to reflect on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's okay. So it is Friday. I want to make sure you have your day so we can hop into it. So how did you get into Black studies?
Yeah, you sent these questions ahead and I was like, oh, wow, interesting, and this one was interesting because I was like, you know what? It's like, and you'll know what I mean by this. I feel like Black studies found me,
Mhm.
Like I never went searching for it, and it's never been, a place that is, like I went and applied for like a Black Studies program or anything like that. It was fascinating because it's like as my trajectory has gotten deeper and deeper into thinking about social justice, thinking about projects like abolition and decolonization, particularly thinking on our projects around like what does it legitimately mean to enter into a realm of like human liberation,
Mhm.
that inevitably led me to Black Studies. Black Studies is, one of the hearts, as we know. When you talk about epistemologically, ontologically, organizing wise, the construction of political projects, you know, um, that work, right? That body of work, whether we're talking from like the liberation movements of like the 50s and 60s, that France Fanon moment, like an incipient kind of moment, and like what has come to be called and known as Black Studies as a field, or even much deeper, of course, with all their respective influences. It's the first touching on soil here and the first entering of relations,
Mhm.
all of that though. And I think that on a personal level, right, has been like there's been multiple different, justice projects by the nature of work that, I've entered into conversation with, I've touched upon, have been um, Black Studies, I think, as a broad, and I love that it's almost, not a place. It's like a idea, it's
Mhm.
like a trajectory. It's to the point of like Sylvia Winter, like a human being as praxis. It's not
Mhm.
it's not a building. It's not even a discipline, even as it's like trying to be reined in. Like I think about here in Atlanta, the Institute of the Black World, right? This was an institute that refused state sanctioned funding and capitalist funding in order to gather, the top minds, and Black liberation movements at the time period, right? To be able to gather, even as folks were kind of restrained and, touched upon and moved within respective, institutions, higher education institutions that were sanctioned, so all those things together, and being someone who's like racialized as an Asian guy, I was like, that's wild that, how the hell, end up here. But then again, that also speaks to the deep liberatory politics of Black
Mhm.
as an area in the field. You know, um, I can't say that, every justice movement has and will and would invite me, into conversation and, would be happy for my contributions, would, see entering into relations with me and my respective, distinctive kind of upbringing where I come from. Again, all that speaks to the power of the field, and it's like, speaking of like, the book, right? I think about this, even my trajectory of, within my work, thinking about love, as a social justice based politics, right? Thinking about love is not something that's possessive, but love as a mutual responsibility, a consensual mutual responsibility that requires mutual vulnerability. And as, Black Studies has been a space and invited me in these different ways, it has increased my sense and need to be responsible to the field, to be responsible to the folks who dedicate themselves to this work. So whenever I get invitations, or I'm received, or I am, put in these places, I'm obliged, I'm happy. It's a deep honor, right, to be in these spaces and to, do that. I don't take it lightly, as a thing. Like, I have that book, and its tentative title is Gathered by Heart. Love is Pedagogy for Collective Liberation. And it's funny, just even speaking on that note, right, of the invitations is, and you met her, Ashley, when we were, as a part of the work, because you're a part of that work too, which is, a funny coincidence and things. Not so much, coincidence, like literally just is the trajectory, right?
Mhm.
Maisha Anderson, who's now a professor over at the University of
Oh.
San Diego doing theater and performance studies, like there was a part in that dissertation that you were a part of that conversation with, Dr. Crenshaw. And I joked with her about, this would be a fun play. This would be a fun thing to stage. And she's like, let's do it. I was like, wait a second. So like the book is under review, but we're now like I'm going to be speaking at UC San Diego as part of a salon series that she's created with Black feminist playwrights. And again, I'm like, Black feminism has been an area within the realm of, say, Black studies. It has its own relationships, its own genealogies and things, but that invitation is the same. I'm like, that's wild that I'm going to be speaking in a Black feminist salon series, right? That's a part of that by invitation, and I'm happy to do it. Like, I'm so grateful, and the receiving that work, and that work, as is covered in the book, is a project about thinking about how do we engage in teaching and learning as a process, right? To actually enact a legitimate love politics that supersedes, the boundaries of what, Sylvia Wynter might call the bourgeois order of things.
Mhm.
The categorization, the elite capture, right, in the words of Taiwo, of identity-based politics, which was meant as a broad, human liberation project. Like Black studies trying to reincorporate all these different folks into a larger global movement, and then extremely, heightened fascist imperialist times. So that's a really long answer to say, my entrance to Black studies has been through my relation to justice and human liberation as a project, and how Black studies has been a shining light, a an entry point, a center for that work, for as almost as long as some of those movements have become incipient and been developed and are continuing today. Yeah.
There's a lot in there that I wanna, like,
Yeah, you had a big question. I was like, "Oh, I don't know. Let me just throw some on the wall. Let's find out what sticks." So
so one, like, thinking about your book and the importance of a love politics and a love pedagogy, what and I know, like, we've talked a little bit offline about kinda, like, the way that the book is structured and the, interdisciplinary nature of its construction, right? And so
Mm,
one of the things that I think is interesting and that we have talked a lot about with different guests is, like, what are the methods that you
mm.
right? Because Black studies is interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, or anti-disciplinary, depending on who you ask.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, is
absolutely.
it is so what types of methods did you use in your research and in your praxis?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Yeah, no, man, I've loved our conversations as we talked about that. And I even love that framing too. I don't know if I've, heard that framing in that particular way, just anti-disciplinary. 'Cause that's real. It's like it's an
That
abolition politics of knowledge, you
that's
know?
what, Dr. Ruth Nicole Brown called it.
Ooh, yes. Okay, Ruth Nicole Brown, of course, of course. I was that surprises me nothing at all. It's exactly what I would expect. Um, but yeah, on that note, is say, at the time period in its earliest phases of what would become the book, right? I think you're at Stanford by that time. I'm at Stanford.
Mhm,
Studies. I enter in, shout out to H. Samuel Lee, who was my advisor and continues to be a collaborator and, a deep partner in the work, justice and otherwise, you know, um, thinking about, this program called Race, Inequality, and Language and Education, which at its phases, like I think I was the first cohort, and now it's developed into like this large entity that's trying to engage the work on a higher level,
mhm.
there. With its own facets and operations and tensions, and like anything else as a project. But during that time period, right? I think we've talked about this. Like I've always been fascinated, right? Like I love learning. I love learning, you know, and I'm always trying to learn, things on the own terms. And even from the time I was a young kid, it was just weird to think about, oh, that's the philosophy question. That's the history question.
Mhm.
That's a whatever question. That didn't make sense to me. It's not the way that I think humans function. It's not the way that we engage in legitimate, honest knowledge production. So when I entered there, H. Samuel Lee, another scholar, very similar, right, in orientation in that particular way, which is why I think he resonated. And it's like, oh, you know what, I can help this kid out. Let me get him up in here. We can talk about some things, encourage his studies and his development. So during that time period, as I was beginning training, right, like I'm talking with, Guadalupe Valdez, who's like a Latina scholar who's doing, work that is in some nature ethnographic, but is related to discourse, right? Also interdisciplinary. I'm of course thinking with H. Samuel Lee, who's in hip hop studies, Black studies,
Mhm.
linguistics, anthropology, all these different types of things. I got Jonathan Rosa, right, who comes in and, as a key part of the development of my studies. Think about even his conceptualization with Nelson Flores and others, right? Ratiolinguistics, a conceptualization that's thinking about
Mhm.
how race informs language, language informs race, and these different types of ways that's, not able to be released, right? It's something that is interconnected in ways that are indelible. So at that time period, with those types of influences that I'm getting, and I'm just only naming a few names off the top of my head. I'm like, you know what? I want to think about how youth and young people enduring these conditions, whether it's say be mass incarceration, hyper policing, ongoing processes of coloniality, and like putting settler colonialism kind of into the mix of things, all these forms of violence, which some even at that time period I'm still developing the language to even name those things as the jargon that they've become, right? I just know young people are enduring things, my own respective upbringing, I reflect upon the things that I was enduring, and I'm thinking about how learning was powerful for me and how learning continues to be a powerful part of liberation movements, of freedom movements, whether folks want to acknowledge or not. And I say that because, like, a lot of times the movements that we see, what we see is the outcomes. We see folks who are pronounced or described as being in their final form, so to speak, in different types of ways. They're ones who have quote unquote knowledge, right? They're ones who are already at a critical consciousness level. They're already processing. But at the roots of it, we're thinking about they had to get there. Get there in some formal way. They started somewhere, right? And they don't just start somewhere, right? There's something that sustains that movement in a way that grapples with there's constant shifts and changes of the ground, the air, the whole vicinity of injustice and justice that's taking place, and there has to be an intellectual project that's engaging that in some sort of form, function, or way, right? So with those questions, I was like, this is a big question. It's like, what do you do with that, right? So Dr. Aleem had been working, with a community that I call Bay Grove in the book for some time, right? I'm introduced to this respective community, and it's a community, right, that's Black, Latinx, Polynesian, Fijian Indian. It has multiple through lines throughout those different things that complicate the racializations, right? You have Afro-Panamanians, you have Tongans, you have Samoans, you have, Salvadoreño folks, you have, Mexican folks from different regions with different relationships to indigeneity, you have across all these different things, the scatterings of folks with, whether they pushed out of their indigenous lands and landed with migrancy in a respective place and they're undocumented or a few generations in, or you're somebody from the American South, right, who fled, those particular violent, captive enslavement, the fungible of human bodies, all those different conditions of white supremacy, right, and then landed in that respective place and area. So entering that place, right, I'm initially at the perspective where, Dr. Leem's like, all right, if you like this idea about developing relationships with people and thinking about that, we can't really understand what's happening until we spend some time there. That sounds like ethnography. That sounds like anthropology. We got problems with that, but that might be a place. And I was like, all right, cool. And something that deeply has fascinated me from the time I was a kid. Like, my mom had the gift of gab, like she could say undo so many things with words, all sorts of things. It was magic almost in the way that I would see it, and I was always fascinated with the way that language is this thing that, allows what is sometimes invisible to be out loud, to literally be visible, to literally be seen. It's a way of delving with things that we pretend like we can't deal with because maybe it's in people's heads, right? It's a projection, it's an expression, just like art is, which we can get to art too, and the ways that it happens. But all right, so I got the whole anthropological thing. All right, cool. Ethnography is a possible method. And then I discover, right, in those type of realms, linguistic anthropology, right? There's these folks who are operating off an anthropological ethnographic lens, but they're also fascinated with language, right? And the best place to study that in the context where we're at Stanford is the linguistics department, really. Like, we have, some folks who are famous for that work, whether it's John Rickford, shout out to John Rickford, OG legend, deeply indebted. He worked with me on my master's thesis in those different ways. You have Penny Eckert, social linguistic heavyweight, did anthropological work. You had Rob Pedesva, Sharice King, now who graduated, was like at the same type of level. Now she's doing big things where she's at, with the different things that are happening, right? So I'm diving into linguistics, right? And I'm thinking about phonology, phonetics. I'm thinking about morphosyntax. I'm thinking about, lexicon. I'm thinking about semantics and pragmatics, thinking about the sociological constructions of, language and how it's tied to the sociological constructions of human bodies, racializations, and those different things that are taking place. All right, so I got that. Cool. And then for what we know, right, our relationship, like this whole hip hop thing, like I started off work doing hip hop. And it's funny, like, I don't know if anybody in hip hop, even when they come a quote unquote hip hop scholar, thinks about it as a method, right? At the jump, at least, right? You're like, oh,
Mhm.
hip hop has a method, but hip hop is inherently pedagogical. It
Yeah.
inherently is a knowledge producing project, right? By nature of how it functions, however you get introduced, whether it's through movement, whether it's through, emceeing, rapping, singing, whatever, vocal kind of like integration, whether it is like through like graffiti or some sort of visual arts, whether it is, through DJing, the production of the music, or just like, getting on the corner talking mess, around
Mhm.
things with a critical cipher type mentality, right? So I'm thinking about hip hop in that way. And hip hop has its own epistemological framework, right? This knowledge of self, this idea that you can't understand yourself without understanding the community and the world that's around you. So that orientation gets into the mix, and I start to learn slowly over time this thing that H. Samuel Lean, with his mentor from Philly, not too far away, James Spady, who's of course a legend for this thing that he called hip hopography, but more broadly, just an organic Black intellectual project of documenting people in their own words, on their own terms, in the ways that they would be proud to share, that is able to keep and pass on information in the deepest, most radical ways, that Angela Davis sense of grasping at the roots.
Mhm.
So all those things are things I'm learning. And of course, I got the conventional things, which are letting me things that maybe things I don't want to do, or things that I might need many more years to be able to think about as a methodology. Like thinking about, I have to take those quant classes like we all do, right? And something that's fascinating is like, I think more than anything, the training I get from that is like the fetishization with numbers, and how this fetishization with numbers is lauded as some sort of, technocratic, like solutionary, almost like, uh, in the words of Sylvia Winter, extra human entity that's just passed on through people.
Mhm.
A higher order passes on through these quant heads into these papers, and that becomes, the God speaking through about what the knowledge is. And that was fascinating, right? And let me know. And I do a little bit of like some counting things, my, social linguistics master's thesis, there. But I was like, that should only be a part if it's worthwhile and if it's needed, and if that's the question demands some sort of nature of
Mhm.
demographics or knowing the broader spectrum of these different types of things that are there. And then of course you take the classic qualitative classes and you're getting notions, right? And they're complexified within these other subfields of interviews and, artifact analysis. And I'm also taking classes with Alison Hobbs, who's a professor over at Stanford, right?
Mhm.
Historian, and I've always been fascinated with history in those different types of ways, so I'm thinking about all these different things that are helping me get back to that rooted question about folks are learning together in order to develop a critical consciousness to sustain, develop, hone, foster movements for human liberation and freedom. And it's an aspect where I'm deeply fascinated by. So all that takes me to the place that I call Bay Grove that's in the book, right? Where I'm there. And my initial idea as I'm there is I'm thinking about in social linguistics, this thing that they call discourse chains. Right. And discourse change is fascinating to me because it's a methodology that's allowing me to kind of enter into a possible way of answering that question, maybe, but on the other side of that question, right? Because the other side of that question is, in order to do movements for human liberation, there has to be some substantiation of how oppression functions, how the
Mhm.
mass incarceration functions, how, the coloniality functions, so it could be on both sides. But I'm thinking at the jump of it, I'm fascinated by, as folks are trying to develop a critical consciousness, how they make sense of small, perceived, minute instances of injustice, and how that accumulates according from a micro to a meso to a macro level to develop into, larger sociological, issues that are maybe starting in discourse, but then become institutionalized in different types of ways. So, and it's cool. It's a cool little methodology. I was like, oh, cool. Like, these little words, you can literally like track, different things that are happening. And I would track, especially around the first election of Trump, some discourse chains that would happen that would substantiate some of those different things. But along the way, right, with that initial grounding kind of curiosity, which I hadn't worded as my main question at that point. I was talking, to Dr. Lima at that time, who was advising me, with, Dr. Rosa, who's advising me, these folks that are advising me. And I was just thinking about issues of justice, right? So I'm still trying to get a sensibility of that. But what happens along the way is, part of ethnography is, you want to, and it's just part of the nature of our work, like it spoke to me as a method because this is what I do in general. Like, I don't turn to a community and be like, hey, let's do some interviews or hey, let's have some deep conversations. I was like, you got to get to know some folks. And
Yeah.
often there's reciprocity. And I think being racialized as Asian, and this is from the time period of me in a community where it's predominantly Mexican, right, with a sizable white population, and then kind of specklings of people racialized as Asian, Pacific Islander, and Black, right, these different things, all the way to the time that I'm entering this community, which is predominantly Latinx, Black and Polynesian, right, is I'm never at a space where I'm like with somebody or people or a group or a conglomeration who looks like me. I'm always distrusted, right? There's always a different relation. And in my work, I eventually put this in a conversation with, Frantz Fanon and, Sartre's kind of introduction that's there, that becomes the book Nervous Conditions, right, in English literature, thinking about this uneasiness and the generativity of uneasiness. Because if we're inevitably complicit with colonial realities, sometimes the best ways to approach that is to never get comfortable, right, in those different ways. So I embrace that as a approach of entrance. But all that's to say is like, all right, I dive in, I start working with who's in the culturally sustaining book as well as in my dissertation, someone I give the pseudonym Mr. Just. Shout out to Mr. Just, who knows who he is. You might watch this, great educator, phenomenal teacher. He's doing performance arts and teaching. He becomes somebody I develop a relationship with. So I start working with him. He's running these drama classes, these classes that are engaging social justice, but through the arts, right? Which is why Dr. Leem got connected with him and why he connected me with him. He's running this amazing after school program that I nickname, based upon things, The Courageous Writers, where folks are engaging in theater to kind of engage with, projects of justice and liberation. And during this time period, also he gets into restorative justice, right? There's the facilitator there, Mr. Sandy and Mrs. Sandy, who are pseudonyms in the book. Shout out to them as well, right? Who are in those type of mix. They start trying to, think about an educational way to make it so all young people within a schooling environment and context can like embrace the principles of restorative justice in their relationships. So I'm participating and I'm starting to support. And as a part of that process, right, I'm developing these relationships with these youth and young people. And something I come to find, right, is that they love Mr. Justice's class and some of these ideas around justice, but they want more. It's like, it's like, then they got to go calculus. Then they got to go to whatever the heck that thing is. They're like, man, this is like the real mess. This is what I want to get at. This is what it is.
Mhm.
So I was like, you know what? I start to develop, like, say, who's in the book, like Oscar and Asada, and Angela, these different, young people, right, who are brilliant that I meet through Mr. Just and being in the space. And I start to think about what I could offer in addition to expand the offerings that are there, right? And at this point, I'd been working in Oakland. I started an after-school program called Fresh that was doing things with other folks that were there. We co-collaborated to make use of hip-hop in an after-school, space that was there. In New York, I did this other college access program that had an arts-based component that was there. So I'm entering here, and I've, had some years developing youth-based programming, and, it was a familiar process, especially in after-school spaces where I'd been doing a lot of work. So I work with them. I was like, what happens if we create something? Because it appears like this is a lively culture in this environment of hip hop, right? It's like, y'all, like we were talking mess after class. We were talking between the passing periods. We're doing it as part of assignments that would lend within any culturally relevant, sustaining frame that this would be something that would be, helpful, something to be celebrated, something to be appreciated, to expand in the ways that young people want. So I create this after school program, right, that's oriented around hip hop, and it's incorporated with, youth and young people. And I'm trying to study these discourse chains that are happening, right, trying to understand the phenomenon that are happening as I'm developing relationships with them. Something that's interesting, right? And this is the whole, ethnographer thing. You don't really come in with the question. It kind of comes to you type of thing as you're developing relationships. Is I start to hear, linguists would call it like metapragmatically, right? Just, people talking about something, in talking about something. It's
Mhm.
love all the time, right? When something's happening or an injustice happens, love will pop up in some way. When administrators are talking about why they do something, love pops up. Like when teachers are talking about something, love pops up. When the kids are trying to build together to do something, love will pop up. And I was like, I had, of course, and I talk about this in the beginning of the book. I'm like, I was not starting my fascination, my journey with like love as a project because I had so many people be thinking about it. Oh, that's a, wishy-washy, whatever, whatever, something. It's not substantial. It's, not engaged with any sort of like real justice projects and the thing. It's been all these different things. But I was like, you know what? I got to pay attention to this. Right. So I think an incipient work that really takes me, I was like, ooh, which helped me plug into some place where I was like, oh, wow, I've been thinking about this forever. And I didn't even know it. Right. Which we can get into that was Jennifer Nash. She has this Black feminist piece, which is brilliant for anybody who's watching this podcast. If you've not got a chance to think about love deeply, you got to check Jennifer Nash's piece. Right. She does a review of like, all right, so there's this intersectionality thing. Cool, we got that. We know that. She's like, Black feminists been doing way more things than just intersectionality. Y'all are just tripping on this tiny little piece, right? Which is important, and y'all grappled onto that. Cool, whatever. It has its own power. But love politics, right? And that's where it gets into this notion of like, mutual responsibility. Like this notion that, love, as it's often talked about next to capitalism, coloniality, is this possession notion. It's like, if I love you, I own you. And if you love me, you own me. And if our terms of ownership by our contracts as property doesn't fit, then, that means that it needs to be broken of contract and reestablished as a contract. And, if I love these kids, then I own these kids, right? And these kids belong to me. And if they belong to me, they need to do these things for me, right? It's this whole colonial project around kind of exists that we do not talk about in public, right? Jennifer Nash unpacks this, and I start reading all these other works, right, in part connected to her work that's related to that. And this incipiently happens at the moment where there's a session where I'm trying to help, because at this point there is, for lack of a better word, like, male identifying, boy identifying youth that are there to engage with hip hop, and girl and identifying youth, right? And there's like a different relation with hip hop that they're having in the space, crossovers that are happening. So I come up with this idea, right? I've done different things in the past where I was like, I'm going to kind of disrupt some of these different norms because there's these dominant discourses, which we know, and Hip Hop Education Center and Martha Diaz and others have been working on this forever, right? Like, women been a part of hip hop forever. Like, it's like, it's a whole thing that they're not constructed as, that they're not seen as, that they're invisibilized as. And we're not just talking about, oh, they've always been behind the scenes doing business, whatever. No, they've been artists too. They've been doing all these different things. Folks just don't know. Because it's like they're not put up by the capitalist machinery because of patriarchy, these different things, to thrive, just like any others would. And, our current moment, it's changing up in some fascinating, interesting ways. That's another conversation for another day. At this time period, like, that's not the norm, right? So I create this entire kind of like thing where like, the youth and young people are going to be experiencing nothing but women identified artists from across the world. Right. And these are artists where it's like, yeah, you get a few, like, I drop in mainstream quote unquote artists like a Cardi B at the time who's popping off. And then you got like a Trina, right. And different things like that. But I'm also talking about like Shadia Mansour. I'm talking about, Gabalonia, right. Out of, Venezuela, these different artists, and young people are loving it. Right. They're eating it up. They're engaging it. Even the young men, they can't help but bars. It's like bars. It's like, damn, it's like these are hitting it, whatever it is. Right. But, there's a moment that happens, which I talk about in the book, where there's a young boy that's there. And it's like, this is what you would expect. If I was a more seasoned educator now, I wouldn't make this decision, right? These different types of ways. Like, you're 13 to 15, you're a boy identifying person, you've been socialized a particular type of way because of patriarchy. So his thing is to like, he's like, can I share something? Right. And I was like, the videos are over. I was like, cool, yeah, throw something up there. And I was like, in hindsight, I was like, it was a bad decision. You see where this is going, right? And he throws on like, and it's a Latinx Mexican identifying boy, right? He throws on this Chicano rapper, and it's cool for a little bit. And he has some social justice cues, which later on I would be able to engage and talk with different things. But he has some misogynistic things that just drop in the middle, and the girls are like, oh, they felt like they got duped. They're like, hey, we had this whole women's center space. I thought we were doing something or whatever. And maybe if it had been like a mixed thing, it wouldn't have been a thing. But because it was supposed to be dedicated in that way and it popped up like that, Asada, who's in the book, like, she's like, to me, she was very polite. She's like, because she knew what I was trying to do. She's like, thanks, Mr. Wong, for whatever, but we got to go. We got to pop off. And they're like, in essence, as I get, they're not coming back. In so many different types of ways, right? So that is a moment where it drops from, all right, I'm doing discourse chains. I've been reading this love material. I was like, there's something happening. And I got to do something about this, right? There's something afoot, right? And my goal, right, is in any liberation thing is like, how can I get everybody in the room, right, back into the room and get rid of the structural material conditions that made it so those things don't happen again.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where love politics comes in, right? And it ends up developing, right? And I co-developed with, Angela and, Asada in the book, the space that comes to be called the Critical Feminisms Club, right? In so many different types of ways, asking them, what is it, that you all would imagine would be the beautiful space that you envisioned, right? And they come up with this incipient, like, Black feminists, intersectional feminist, third world feminist kind of like ideology of a space that includes the arts, right? It has like a hip hop feminist lens, and we'd invite Joan Morgan. She would come to the club, later on, like as it's been, later on developed, right? That'd be a definite part of the conversation. But it arrives around that as I work with the boys, right? I'm like, we're going to continue to have this space, and I'm developing, right, within the space, like the ideas around, the ways that they speak about love, complexifying it through like a broader love politics, and trying to think about and open the doors to see patriarchy on the side, and I think collective liberation, and think about the structures that are at the school. And that book is just a story, right? It's a story of how I attempt to make those bridges, and it has to do with me at center too, because it's like I was somebody who created this space, and I was having to dig deep to think about my own relationship to love and love politics, and what would I need to do and change and shift and move and develop in order to be able to embrace that as a politics and think about the ways these things come together. And along that way of the journey, which is how the book is structured, right? I dive deep into like, if y'all don't know, love politics is deep. And of course, I would recognize my sentiment, James Baldwin being like, where I personally started. Like, when I first started reading something deep, like Baldwin became like an ancestor to me, someone who spoke to me. And that was where foundations for love and my idea about social justice is like my DNA is love through like a particular Baldwinian type of lens. And I embrace that as a part of like the book and those different things. But the book is structured around, I was looking around. So this alternative vision, that's not the capitalist vision, the colonial vision, the possessive vision of love. What are some of the earliest ruminations, right? What are some of the earliest kind of reverberations? I got, of course, Ash here that's thinking about the relationship with Black feminist politics, but I'm trying to think about world politics across these different vicinities, anti-colonial politics, because love often ends up being the heart. Of course, Robin Kelly talks about it in his work. So I'm trying to think, I'm bridging older and older and older. And the oldest story I get to is probably familiar to folks in Black studies. So folks have different things, right? Which I won't go into detail then with it, is around Isis and Osiris, right? These figures from a spirituality much, as we know, preceding all the whole Christian thing and the whole Judeo-Christian thing and the whole it's indigenous based culture, right, that's happening around. And there's a telling of the story between Isis and Osiris, right? And just to make it short, right, to say how it structures this book is to think about Isis and Osiris are within this realm of deities. The earth is supposedly at that time period pretty cool. Things are legit, right? Things are happening. But Osiris has got this brother, Set, right? And Set wonders what would happen if he be the one who was in charge of things, right? So one day, Set's jealousy overcomes him. He makes a plot and a plan. He invites his brother and then, Isis and then all these other deities to this like grandiose kind of like brunch, man. They're going hard. They're drinking things. They're having fun. They're doing things. And then Set comes out of nowhere with his plot and his plan, jumps on the table, pulls out a weapon, and then kills his brother. And then eventually we'll chop him up into 14 pieces, right? And his goal with this is to eliminate the memory of his brother, so his rule can be paramount. It can be, right? So he scatters his brother's, parts along the Nile, all 14 pieces, right, that are there. And Isis at the first jump, right, with her deep love, right? And this story usually centers Osiris as the main figure through a patriarchal rendering. But if you think about, maybe the real message is Isis. And like what she says, this is the radical love that's happening when there's this story outside this patriarchal lens, right? She's initially, incarcerated in essence, right, by, Set. And after 7 days, 7 nights, right, she's like, screw this. She hits up Thoth, the god of time, lets her free. And she's like, I'm going to reassemble Osiris, right? And we're going to restore justice to what it's going to be, right? So there's so many different variations of this telling, but the through line through a lot of those tellings is that she starts going around the Nile and has the help of Sebek, right? This other deity to kind of search and look for and find the parts of Osiris. And every time she finds a piece of Osiris, she builds a temple and prays and tries to honor, that piece of him, right? And the memory. And this continues as a practice all along the Nile until she gets to, the 14th piece and she can't find it and she gives a part of herself, right? And in giving that part of herself, she's able to restore Osiris with the help of the god of time, so they can conceive of someone who has more power than them both, who would be able to defeat Set, right? And this is the birth of Horus, right? Who becomes the thing, and Horus eventually battles Set. He's about to lose again, but then Thoth steps in, passes knowledge to him about the ways that would be able to be defeated, right? He defeats Set and restores justice. But right as he's about to put Set into prison, which could set off this ongoing pattern of violence, Isis is like, nah, snaps her fingers, uses the matches she has, and the chains fall off, right? And there's a piece that's more just than it's ever been that's been restored. And was it Osiris? Was it Horus? Right? It was Isis in that story. So my book is like, ooh, there's so many lessons that are there. And it's structured in 14 parts, just like the division that was there, and thinking about how the main folks in the story, me, particularly Asada and Oscar, right, that are in this book, we're each picking up and gathering the pieces of us, right, gathered by hearts, right? And each of us have to give a little piece of ourselves in order to be able to arrive at a understanding that, we have our individual qualms, but at the end of the day, human liberation requires us to have a different politic, to be able to engage with each other. Right. And that's going to be our key to liberation in the third event, Sylvia Winter type of case. But anyway, really long story about, you said methods, right? So those methods were, the anti-disciplinary of all these different zones around a question, and the question changed the methods over time, right? That eventually turned this book where I'm going to get linguists, anthropologists, even maybe Black studies folks, historians, they're all going to see different modes. I don't know how it's going to be received. It is fundamentally anti-disciplinary. As I review now, I'll let you know. But that's that. So,
well, I am very excited about the book. Personally.
Yes. Yeah.
But I also think that, like, the stories that are the multiple stories that are being told in it are so important, right? Like the critical feminism club that was created, that you so graciously allowed me to be in that space a couple times, and being able to be in that space and witness these young students like engage with work that like I wasn't introduced to until grad school, right? And to really take that up and grapple with it in real ways was so inspiring and informing, and it was truly a remarkable space, right? And so I know that the work that is based around that space is going to be as transformative as the space itself was allowed to be.
Wow, that's deep praise. I appreciate you and gratitude to seeing it. Yeah, because I know you witnessed. So you witnessed. It was definitely a special space. Like I had to, find some sort of way of honoring it, which is why this book is taking so long. I was like, I got to do this space justice. I can't just be like, oh, cool, 30 pages. Here we go. That was fun. They gathered. They did some stuff. It was cool. We read some deep stuff. I was like, it was something deeper. I don't think I'm going to think about that space for the rest of my life in a lot of different ways. So yeah.
Well, building on that, so you talked about the methods, and the relationship to discipline or being anti-discipline, and bringing in all of these different ways and lens of knowing. And then even how like just the work itself shifted the question, right? So the question that you thought you were going to explore was not the question that you ended up answering. But I want to ask about how this, and maybe even just like how you're thinking about like love politics. Like, how does this play out in your classrooms now?
Yeah, no, absolutely. like I learned so much from the girls, the gender nonconforming youth, and the boys, all across whether the hip hop club or that critical feminist space, and across my life as I was trying to hone. Because something, and I alluded to it as I was speaking about, that broader project and kind of like my upbringing, right? Is I've always loved learning. That doesn't mean I've always loved school.
That is the word.
And it's just like, that's heartbreaking to me. And I think about a lot of youth and young people who experience quote unquote school the same way, right? And folks can't, and that big word ontology really is a word about an existence and beingness, right? In our Western European descended societies, we cannot disentangle. When we hear education, it equals school.
Yeah.
Our ontology of education is school, rather than thinking about education as a social process of teaching and learning. And does it happen in these places that we call schools, right? And this goes for universities too, and higher education institutions of where they're at, right? So over time, like I feel like, I have like one mentor who I met in Bay Grove, who funny enough now is in Atlanta. I got a chance to have lunch with her not too long ago. Shout outs to Mo Betta, she like was early like, ooh, when I was first trying to get into education, like it's like people imagine like teaching is like, or creating learning spaces or curating spaces of education is some like, oh, if you know something, you can do that, like at some sort of vicinity. Oh, did I discover that was not true? Whether it's that first after school program or the after school program for middle school that I was the teacher for, right, during that time period, and the para educating for all these different periods. It was a lot of years, right, of me trying to dissect what was it that was uncomfortable, so uncomfortable about school as a place, right, and what were the difficulties and how to overcome those difficulties when you're trying to enact what might be that ideal learning space. That's right. So those two different kind of spaces and vicinities, it's difficult to untangle, difficult to unwrap. Right. So something about school, right, upon reflection, and as I got to study and thinking about it, it was a commonality, even though it's funny, like other folks would experience some schools that were more quote unquote liberal or progressive and these things, like I didn't grow up with seeing those. Like when I saw Mr. Justin's classroom, I was like, what is this? I was like, there's spaces in schools I could do this type of stuff. Like, I don't even know, it was, from my perception of different things. But for the most part, I know my experience was not the, the, oh, that's just a minority kid. No, I was the majority of experiences. Most kids experience school the ways that I experience school. They don't experience it the ways that they were like Mr. Justice classroom, whatever. And everybody will usually have their one association of a teacher that they love. Like for me, it's my third grade teacher, Miss Moore, who I still know this day. Now she's Dr. Moore. She was funny enough, one of the few Black teachers that was at my elementary school, right? And I was one of the few Asian kids, and she looked out for me. And there's another story that's incipient, thinking about like how Black studies politic, right, in a broader Black frame, found me more than anything, and that I develop a responsibility in response to those different notions of things. But all to say is, when I see schools for the most part, outside of kind of when they have those little ideal types, right, that people might identify, it bothered me that, like it ends up being places that center punishment for the most part, quote unquote classroom. Half the game is just like, sit down, do your work. Only sharpen your pencil when I say you should sharpen your pencil. We're only going to learn the things that I say that I think that you want to know. These different types of ways. And for me, that was not something like, I thought about being a teacher because I love education, but I was like, no, that's not what I'd be doing. The ways that I'd seen, I was like, why would I want to become a warden in essence, or in those little type of spaces? I was like, that's not me. But then it's like, of course, and this is like talking about some of the politics that come up with, and I'm thinking about writing about, and hoping to contribute to, and other folks who've been thinking long about this work too, saying the realm of abolition. Sometimes the response is, right, and this is the difficulty of establishing and restoring and then sustaining and fostering institutions that do otherwise, right? That oftentimes they do otherwise. It's like the first start is like, you just don't do any sort of form of, collective responsibility, right? Because that's all that, supposed to be safety and cost management is about, is like, you need to get folks together and sustain them to be together to do something, right? And that is through state-sanctioned projects, often violent. Violence is the answer in those different types of ways, right? And abolitionist projects automatically think about, they're like, we need to get rid of cops. We need to get rid of prisons. but they don't think about, all right, so we still need to have things in our communities that are
Yeah.
around collective accountability.
Yeah.
When violence happens, what do we do? When harm happens, what do we do? Right? Those different things. And that becomes a after school, out of school education question too. Even though like I'm within educational spaces, like the ideal type of creating a space is that space then, and this is the funny part about education in most societies, it resembles the society, right? It's supposed to be helping you transition into the larger society. So those institutions where you learn will be a part, right? So if we're trying to imagine these liberatory futures, right, and these different things, having to come up with what is the difference maker, what is the way we engage with that differently, right? It's sometimes it's as simple as like I have a comrade over at One Hood talk about hip hop education, just Series X. Like shout out to the crew, they're amazing, they're brilliant, right? Farouk, I was like, I love to death when we were talking about abolition and the abolition of youth prisons. He's like, one significant thing that we could do that might help us get there quicker: get rid of qualified immunity. Bam. Thinking about like some of these literal structures and processes. We don't think about the abstractions of like, what's the difference between, say, what you imagine you need for safety and the cop,
Yeah.
right? And one of the big things, right, is cops aren't accountable. They literally can get away with murder. So it's like if you get rid of that thing, you start to maybe create something different, something otherwise, or create the possibility for something that's different otherwise, right? So within those realms, right, say within the field that's been called now, even though it's like, we were doing, and other folks I've known have been doing this thing for decades under different realms, restorative and transformative justice, right? Something justice classroom too. And a fundamental basis of that is, safety is relationships. And it is how we respond. And it's oftentimes, at the earliest phases to the things that we all need as human beings, right? The things that are within and between us as human beings, right? And how do we create commitments and agreements with each other, right? So my pedagogical basis for my spaces at the university and the higher education level, as well as with youth and young people at the jump, is there has to be some formation. Right. And this is not a cutesy, like, one mic, sit quiet when the teacher talks. It's like, no, this is like, if we're going to talk about entering into a real participatory democracy from a radical revolutionary lens, right? And these different things, we're talking about horizontal. This is a form of accountability that is a different space structurally. You can't have a vertical hierarchy and have restorative and transformative justice. And that's part of the complications that you talk about with the construction of community agreements, whether it's in a K through 12 space or a higher education space. I am sanctioned by the university within a classroom space. No matter what I say, I could be the most well-meaning of all time, but I have more power and I decide what happens with your life, right? In those different types of ways. But at least we can voice that. Right. And that becomes a voicing process that happens with those relationships and what I voice as my attempts of refusal, right, of those different types of logics and different things that are there. And then, of course, within a community itself, right, instead of, appealing to university-based structures, rules, governance, right, when we have different things that happen, like how do we co-create what we want to happen in response to things that were there? And that is a process where oftentimes folks are used to coming up with ideas. They have a hard time putting their ideas together.
Yeah.
It's individualizing, right? So that part of the process starts to develop and hone a community that's there. Folks are used to voting, but they're often used to voting when they're forced onto things. And then it's just that is that. It's just decided forever, right? They're not used to consensus building, which is often, a part of participatory democratic processes. You vote and then you check in being like, all right, this is where we landed. Is this what we want? If we don't, we got to go back and think about things. And maybe voting is not the way. Maybe this thing wasn't, and I just had this with the class I was working with now. It's like, this one only got like this many votes, but it seems like it's important to y'all. And they're like, all right, let's include it. Like it's like, it's not the final end, right? We're not going to accept things. And every class can then shift and change those agreements and those agreements in that space, right? And even K through 12 space we're working with now that I, shout out to Shayna Sullivan. She's a teacher who I worked with at the Alder Graduate School of Education who came up with a variation of doing this during the pandemic. We worked together on co-constructing things, right? It comes up with this, what do we need each other to do and to commit to learn as a fundamental basis.
Mm-hmm.
And that has expanded dramatically. Like I've never had the same community agreements with this. And that's wild. I've taught so many classes. And this is from like Phillips State Prison, and talking about the comrades there that are in those different things. families and incarcerated youth and young people, community college young people, K through 12 young people, Georgia State University, right, of folks. When we have opportunities to create community commitments together, it's different, which lets us people are different. And people have different concerns. They have different relationships with carcerality and coloniality and violence, and expectations. And sometimes that process voices things like the class I had last night. We were thinking about it. One student was like, they added as a possible commitment is like, we should, meet outside of class to kind of form together, be responsible to each other, to help each other learn the content and get through with it. And there was a robust conversation where like folks like, I'm with the spirit of that, but I got 3 jobs. So I'm spirit of that, like, all right, well, this ain't going to be a commitment, but we're going to have voiced this as an aspiration, right? It's not going to be, we can put this in air quotes that are there, but we want to know that there's folks here. And then now there's folks in the class I've connected, like, oh, damn, all right, you 3 want to do that? We're going to form a group, right? These different types of things. That's never happened in the commitments that I've formed. Nobody's ever tried to add that as one of the things that are there, right? All to say is like that foundation of building an alternative learning space is central to a love politics and central to the ways that I operate and I think about every learning space that I'm in. And something else that's kind of key and critical and crucial, and Shayna Sullivan's big on that, but also my sister who's a teacher and other educators that I've been a part of, right, is whether it's a higher education space, or to a kindergarten space, or even maybe a preschool space, all these different types of ways, right, is universal design for learning. That's like the name of education that's been called for things. But how can you create a space, right, where there is not a constant, because you think about when the restorative transformative justice frame, when you have high expectations, but not support to reach those expectations, it's punitive.
Yeah.
So you either gotta lower the expectations, right, to the level of support that you can offer, or you raise expectations with the support in order to get there. Right. And a universal design for learning is a disability frame to think about that same thing. So I was like, if we got folks here that are going with different ways and got different challenges, then we need different structures and frames. Right. So one of the things that I operate with and like trying to within higher education spaces is that, most classes, they got deadlines. You got this thing due. It's due at 5:00. And I got those things that are there on the deadline. But like part of my classes, I was like, y'all are all in different places in life. Right.
Mm-hmm.
These are the main checkpoints that would keep you on track. Some days you're going to be on track. Some days you're not. But no, a consequence. And we're talking about this. There's no punishment here or any of these things. It's like I plan each week, right, to be able to read, review, and add comments and things. If you turn in late, it just means it's going to get later to you. That's all. There's no punishment there. I was like, I'm still going to give you feedback. You just have to wait longer, right? And all these different types of things, right? And students within, say, a higher education environment, they're shocked by this. Like, oh, this is, and I have a mantra that I always say. It's like health and family first always, right? Yeah. Health, family first always. Health, that you don't got to tell me twice. Do what you need to do for you. We'll figure it out. This little degree, these little, incorporating you, as a part of the proletariat into the petite bourgeoisie as a part of a process is not that important at the end of the day, right? We're going to get you there if you want to get there, right? But we got to have your health and you got your family and things happen with your family. Again, we'll figure it out, right? That flexibility freaks people out. But then once they start getting it, they're like, oh, and it starts to become like this open door of like, some folks will turn in reflections early, right? Because they know they can have a family thing they got to go to, some folks will have a hard time, right? And I even have as a hard time, negotiations, and we talk about the appropriate things that need to happen throughout the class. But I was like, I ain't tripping. Like, I want everybody here. If you want an A, you can work and get an A, right? But I'm not giving nobody an A, but we could, with what you're going to get an A, right? So it's like, you can literally go over, right? I'll give you feedback and all these type of things until you get the grade. Like if you want to stop at some point, be like, all right, this is too much work. Give me the B. It's going to be, all right, I'll give you the B. But if you want the A, we'll keep working, right? And the same thing with assignments. If you're having a hard time, right? And Georgia State, man, we are a proletarian institution. It's a night school. Our first class starts at 4:30, right? And then I end my class last night at 10:00, at night, so coming from their day jobs, right? To be able to their PhD, right? And paying for their PhD for the most part, right? No financial aid, no funding, nothing like that. They're there for the love. They're there because they are responsible to their children. They're responsible to their ancestors. They're responsible to themselves and their aspirations and their desires. And that's why they're there. And they need some wiggle room every once and again to make sure that they're learning at their own terms, right? And it's like returning control to the people, right? Talk about exploitation is, controlling what you produce, right? And as not being able to control what you produce is exploitation, right? So how do we put it in the hands of folks with a learning environment where they can control how they're learning and what they're learning and the processes, what they want to learn, right? That goes out there. So those structural mechanisms, right, that are happening are critical to, what I've seen as, aspirational good. You could say just pedagogy in general, but this is like pretty normative in Black studies. Black studies spaces for the most part, they encounter whether it's like youth or whether you have higher education folks, right? Folks have different trajectories which require different structural material responses and conditions. This is not universal, right? There's a lot of trauma up in there. Like we have some folks who are like, we won't say no names out on a podcast, right? Who are doing some amazing, incredible work, but you step in the classroom and be like, ooh, this is like, oh, you the warden too. It's like maybe they can learn about liberation, but that's not what's going on here. So so we won't say it's a stereotypical universal, but we could say this is an aspiration, right?
Yeah.
What I see, right, as Black studies, and like a good example of that here, right? Dr. Joyce King at Georgia State, who was former AERA president, has been doing Black studies, Black liberatory work, student of Sylvia Winter for a minute, right? She got real high expectations in her classes, right? And her advisees, but she gives incredible supports, right? And she has a loving flexibility, right, that she works with each student, trying to help, tender these flames, right, that she's ways from her perspective. It's not dictating, right, but not letting things go, but also always providing the support and fighting when she's not able to, because she's like, man, I'm getting too old to be doing all this type of stuff. He's like, and she's my faculty mentor. She's like, I can put you on the committee. You'll love this student's project. You'll love them. Get up on it. Do that. If you can. And I was like, of course, I would love to, and I've enjoyed that. Like partnership, that collectivity, which again is part of that co-conspiratorial, communal, collaborative love politics tradition, right?
Mm-hmm.
We don't let each other go. And that enters in across classrooms in that instance and space, right? And we're planning events and planning, multiple different things like that. And I have other colleagues who are similarly operating within those different veins. But I see especially, and it's like education as a field, it's stereotypical that we fixate on learning environments and our forms of teaching as being important to our work because that's what we study. But I think more broadly, you can't engage whatever, and we say from an anti-disciplinary framework, whatever discipline you are housed in, I can't see any discipline where you're housed in not trying to weigh a similar pedagogical moments or demand, right? That's like in those particular types of ways. And I've been, grateful to witness, see, and learn from what has been called, right, that Black studies tradition that's there in addition to so many others, right, that are co-coinciding, as part of global projects, which are again thinking about if we are trying to teach about justice and liberation, we got to put it in practice. It's got to be like this little fascination, this fetishization, like, oh, you just got to beat each other up and do every means necessary to get to liberation. I was like, that has not turned out well. Projects that, do not enact the processes that they want to end up in often end up just what they did. And we can see that globally, with a lot of projects that have espoused that they're doing liberatory ideas, but then in practice, they do not. And then we see the outcomes of what that actually means, right, for the folks who are enduring that particular project, right? So anyway.
Thank you. I think that there is a lot there to, one, just like consider implementing, right? Like and thinking about what it means, that the trajectory of community agreements is very interesting. Like that being intentional or mindful of the ways that they are different each time and what that means for a particular space and what people in that space need in that moment versus what you might have expected based upon past spaces, and what and having the aspiration, I think is really important to remember, right? Like everything is not possible right now, but that doesn't mean we don't aspire to it.
That's right.
And just because we can't accomplish it in this moment does not mean that we stop working towards it or we say that's unattainable. It's still there. We just know that it's going to take some more work and some more collaboration and some more building to be able to get to a point where that can be realized. And I think that's super important to remember, especially right now with so many things that might seem more aspirational than realistic. And what it means to keep working towards it, regardless of our current material conditions and realities. So
For
thank you.
real. Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, 2 questions left.
Okay.
Um, so which you've kinda touched on this, so you can elaborate on it or you can be like, "Nah, I talked about that. We can move on." Um, but what interests or excites you most about the past of Black studies?
Yeah. I can always speak so many volumes of this. Like, this is endless for days, right? And like, the first thing that comes to my mind that hasn't been, fluidly touched upon, and just because even before we delved on the podcast, we were talking about it, right? Is like oftentimes the Western ontological perspective of existence says that once something or the person or the thing that as it was written in the past is gone or dead, it is dead. And it's just a reference point. It is not something that has an ontological life that exists and can continue into the present. But if we go within, say, Joshua Myers, even in his work, thinking about, different folks and their relationships with, particular ontologies from particular, say, like in Black studies, a Western African continental perspective, right? With various peoples that are there engaging with time in its own different ways, right? And other
Mhm.
world they engage, like in a Cantonese tradition, it's also, something, that operates in a little different type of way, as I've discovered and learned. Um, but on that note, I'm like, man, there's so many voices of people who you even take for granted, right?
Mhm.
And because there's a Western lens that says, all right, not only are they dead, there's a right and the wrong way to interpret what has happened. And once we've decided what the line or what's the interpretation, it is then just a debate over what's going to be the best interpretation and then to include that into the book, right? Or into the article. And whichever has the most citations and the cumulative value with Mantu and capitalist accumulation, all that type of stuff, then that's the one we follow. That's the authoritative genealogy. That's the authoritative cosmogony of that particular, thing, right? But if you take a different ontological perspective where you're like, what happens if we treat, and this is within indigenous-based traditions, within different things, that's not universal. Some indigenous-based traditions don't have this at all, right? But there have been voices from respective communities that have brought this particularly to light. But if you think about, these folks as ancestors in a lot of different
Mhm.
that continue to have life and to speak to you and their words speaking to you, there's excitement that's there, right? There's like been from, I love me my materialist, my my dialectical materialist, my historical materialist, my Marxists, and they're on that whole little scientific thing. And I'm teaching Marx next class because we're reviewing Sylvia Wynter and her variations of racial capitalism and her identification as a Marxist feminist and her interrogation of like that particular anti-bourgeois project and different
Mhm.
things. And Marxism has lots to offer. But a weakness of, say that turn of man to in that post-coloniality type of period is the scientific basis, right, has pulled out any sort of the mythological, the mythoi, right? In the words of like, Sylvia Wynter, the basis that voices can have outside of reason, right? A ability to remanifest and do different ideas in different types of ways, right?
Mhm.
An example of that in my life, right, that I've done is like I referenced is, when I immediately graduated Berkeley, I started because I've been doing that hip hop after school program in Oakland, right, continuing that program. But then I was invited by Mr. Carl, which I hope is alive and well. I love that dude to death. He was the after school program coordinator and made so many things work and, held me in so many different ways, right? OG, Black man in that community, just like loving the kids, loving the community, different types of things, right? Um, when I graduated, like he got me as best he could for a graduate from Berkeley. I was making pennies. Pennies, like I joke with folks like people like, oh, they find out my Georgia State salary. And I'm like, yeah, no, it's not a lot. It's the most I've ever made. I have not made a lot in my life. And it's not much to me because it's like, I come from, my mom was unhoused at different periods of her life, my Chinese ancestors came here in the Opium Wars and the invasion of the Japan and Manchuria, come with nothing but the clothes on their backs, right? So it's even a privilege to even have some sort of semblance of, materiality that's there. And it's like, even our politics, like we could talk about later, like a politics of sacrifice with justice. Like, folks have this idea, just like there's the conservation of mass, right? That, if mass is here, Mass has to be there. You don't make up mass. Justice is something like, if there's a lot of mass here, you got to give something up. You
Yeah.
got to sacrifice. If there's not a politics of sacrifice, you're doing this little neoliberal capitalist, colonial turn. You're cooperating with the broader, sustenance and the maintenance of that bourgeois order of things, right? In the words of,
Mhm.
I'll also say I was broke. But one thing I found, right, was that, after work, I would either, and one was poison, one was not, right? Where the poison was like McDonald's had these mini meals, right? And you get $1 for like some fries, $1 for some, like chicken nuggets, $1 for a giant.
Is how I survived in New York. So
Exactly. You already know, like our New York life was not too far off of that, right? These are things. Like, took too many student loans. We need to abolish those. Shout out to the abolition of student loans. But talking about the carbon, containment of humans, right? So I'm doing those McDonald's mini meal. Ooh, I feel like garbage after those things. But I find also, right, as I go after, like I'm walking through Berkeley, I'd graduated there, this little restaurant, which I still know this day, called Platino, right? That's down at University. And they, I think, continue to have a lunch special, which is super affordable, right? Where just like beans, rice, some pupusas, some platanos, like sustenance, right? And around the corner from this a Salvadorian restaurant, there was this place which is still around today, Half Price Books, right? And I'd be able to go up in Half Price Books, and they would have books for $1. They'd have books for 50 cents. They'd have books, in different realms. You can bargain with people for books, and people would sell their books there, right? And that I would start to look the shelves, right, and find things that were interesting. And one day I was looking through, and this happened to be just funny enough, like the Black Studies section. And I just happened to have gotten to that section because, again, finding justice, right, and liberation. And I'd been by that time, I'd studied apartheid. I'd been to South Africa. Like, I had a relationship to, particular aspects of those studies. So I knew cool stuff was there. And I was trying to learn more about that and getting those different things. A book that I found in that section, which changed my life, right, was James Baldwin. Right. So I started reading James Baldwin. I would go to the little Salvadorian spot. I would eat my food, sit there for hours, and they would give free refills on the iced tea that are there, So, and the folks and the waiters and waitresses, they all immigrants. They know the same. They ain't bugging me. They're like, oh, and they find out, oh, he's a after school teacher or whatever. They let me just chill there for hours. I go there, I get a book at Half Price Books, and I start with Baldwin, and I slowly start reading every single one of his books one by one. I go after class, go to Half Price Books. I read that book for hours, and I eventually finish that book, go there, read the next one. Because I found out, dude, this dude wrote books. You got so many books. He got his fiction. He got his nonfiction. I'm learning throughout this entire, I'm really reading every single thing he's ever written. And there's something that just it speaks to me on a spiritual level, right? And even after I finish his works, which gets to the point I was making with this ancestry, right, is I continually return over and over again. And every time I read his words, there's a different way it moves me. There's different ideas that arrive there. A new life is turned into it. And he's almost become, for me, like almost like, I've never known the man. He's like a grandfatherly figure in my head. Like, I look to and turn to when I'm in moments of inner turmoil. Like I'll pick up and I remember something he wrote, or I go and read and I'll think about, it's almost like he's talking to me in these different types, which is why I got on my desk right now, like, trying to grapple with different things that are there, but my excitement for the past of Black studies and it as a mode of knowledge production that's becoming more normative. I feel there is a re-engagement that these voices from the past, that we don't need to do the Western White Project, Bantu's project, and accumulate things and find the best variation of things. We could have folks sit as ancestors and help us repeatedly, recursively, create new worlds, right? The foundations of things that can only happen when we're constantly thinking about human as praxis, right? Like, Sylvia Winter, right? And thinking about, say, for instance, like folks take for granted, oh, well, the best thing to do, for the climate is Elon Musk. We got to do green energy. We got to do whatever. But it's like from, say, a perspective of deep relationality and a social justice sentiment, like they might say, oh, if this is unjust to relations, populations, and people, stop it all. And we as humans, we got faith that whatever need that we need to be fulfilled from there, we could collectively, with our ancestors, think about something that wouldn't be doing that. And of course, everything we create, we're humans, we make mistakes, right? But then we can have a recursive process about whenever we see harm happening from something that we created into the world, we can have a conversation to do it. And instead of having, versus in our capitalist world, right, Mantu's world, everything's about profit. It's like what makes the best profit with these different things that determines what we create, co-create, and make in the world. What happens when it's like We revisit things when we need something and when it causes harm to something, whether that is in our current ontological existence, living versus non-living. Because the non-living, quote unquote, deserve the respect and honoring as much as the living. And that's within any radical tradition for the most part, that particularly indigeneity, right? So that is part of my excitement in Black studies as a future, is folks really starting to disentangle even some of so Winter calls it the mimetic trap, right? The retaking in of coloniality in these neo-colonial type of ways, repeating the same logics that that we've been forced to have, discharging those, right? And allowing the past to do something different. And it's not like a past doesn't repeat itself type of thing within like a Western type of frame. This is like the past can do different work. And, if we enter into the past as a real interlocutor, not something that's dead, the possibilities. So
thank you. That was so important. And I think a really interesting way to think about it, how you went from what we were talking about before to that.
That was a journey, right?
But I appreciate the journey because I do think that it encapsulates so much, like you said, in so many different liberatory traditions, right? That to shift your thinking, what is like what we consider to be dead or what we call dead is not gone, right? And the acknowledgement and the return to what has been done in the past is so important. And I think so many people in Black studies and people in general who are from traditions outside of that Western lens do that. Right? And so it's something that happens that we might not consciously think about. But it's so important to how many of us operate anyway.
Yes.
That it's a good reminder that like this is work that we're already engaged in.
Yeah.
And let's think about how we can do that work more and more intentionally in ways that can help us in this moment.
For real. No, absolutely. It opens up a whole world of possibilities of, us as humans.
Yeah.
Because it's like, what do we cut ourselves out? Like, white supremacy is constantly invested in the erasure of the past.
And
that is a death of our future. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for all of your amazing insights and reflections and knowledge and the work that you are continuing to do, which is so important and impactful and inspiring. Sorry, I don't know what's happening outside of my window right now. But is there anything you would like to add before I give you back the rest of your Friday afternoon?
Well, shoot. I was just, blessed, honored that, got this invitation from you. Like I don't think as I said, I'm not taking nothing from me. It was a gift, to have you, in the middle of this day, especially at the beginning of this semester with the world and all the places that it is, I hope that, more gifts come, just like this conversation happens. And, yeah. And for anybody who's listening, like on those different types of things, like I hope, that as we kind of encounter wherever this goes, in the different realms that it is, that we don't lose sight of what is possible when we don't take for granted what we're supposed to take for granted. And in Black studies being one particular perspective on the world that has helped us do that. So
well, thank you so much again for your time and brilliance. It's always amazing to catch up with you. And we'll talk again soon.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I'm looking forward to it,